So good afternoon, everybody, back there in the Zoom world. Welcome to our spring quarter lecture series event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Eric Howeler for our last lecture of the year. First, some biographical data. Eric Howeler is an associate professor in architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he teaches across all levels in the architecture department. He has worn many hats in the school. He has served as director of thesis, course studio coordinator, and has recently been appointed as area head for the Masters of Design Studies in the Energy and Environment program. And altogether, he's really a teacher extraordinaire. Eric is co-founding principal of the Boston-based practice Höweler Yoon Architecture, a research-driven multidisciplinary design studio working between architecture, art, and media. The office has been recognized with an extensive list of awards that include the Architectural League Emerging Voices Award, the BSA Honor Award, the American Architecture Prize, and the European Center for Architecture Award, to name just a few. Höweler Yoon's work has been widely exhibited in venues across the world, including the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Cooper Hewitt in New York, and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. Their projects have also been recognized with features in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Architectural Record, Domus, and the Wall Street Journal. Eric is a prolific author as well. He has authored and co-authored several books, many on skyscrapers, an office monograph titled Expanded Practice, another book called Unsolicited Small Projects for the Big Dig, and he has published essays and articles in Perspecta, Archis, Thresholds, and the Architect's Newspaper, among others. This is clearly a very impressive collection of biographical information. I would say that, however, it might not fully capture the importance of Eric and Mijin's contributions to the landscape of contemporary practice and education. Eric's practice and his teaching continue to push disciplinary boundaries across a broad spectrum of important registers in our discipline, ranging from material and tectonic invention to the reimagining of public spaces. Their commitment continues to be to the design excellence and to innovation. A small note on logistics. We are on a webinar format. Eric is going to present, and then either throughout the presentation or right after, for the people in the audience, please submit your questions in the chat, and we'll relay them back to Eric for the Q&A portion. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. It is a pleasure to welcome you to UCLA.
Thank you, Mariana. Thanks so much. Maybe I'll share my screen. Hope it shows up in the right spot. Oh, it's not the right spot. Okay. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be in LA for a moment in my mind, imagining how you all are doing out there. And I know it's sort of the end of the semester, so thank you for coming. I know final reviews are coming. I should also say Mijin sends her regrets. We both agreed to do it and then realized that one of us has to get our daughter from the bus. So she's doing that. I'm gonna show you some of our thoughts. So I thought I'd call this lecture, What's the Matter? It's a theme that we've been thinking about a lot these days. What's the matter is a kind of way to take stock of the moment. I think it's always good to sort of know where you are, what's going on. It also asks, what matters? So what's the matter, but also what matters? And how do we as architects sort of build what matters? And how do we sort of turn our sort of thinking into material, into matter itself? So it's a useful way to think about the present. If we sort of just survey the contours of the present, we find ourselves in an awkward moment where everything that we've been taught about social distancing and the pandemic is sort of starting to thaw, yet we still have to sort of relearn what it means to be social. Pre-pandemic, we had already experienced the kind of insertion of technologies into the public realm, into every interaction, every encounter. And we've sort of developed a kind of dependency on our devices. This is obviously pre-pandemic, but it's sort of at its own sort of at its own scale of, of ailment. At the same time, we live in what we call the kind of planetary age or the information age, which is great. On the other hand, we've never felt like we know exactly what's going on. The amount of redaction, obfuscation, secrecy, and opacity, I think, is also unprecedented. So at the moment where we live in the information age, it also coincides with the moment of post-truth. At the same time, we feel politically more and more divided than ever. There seems to be little we can agree on. And so what does all this information, all this technology lead us to? And while we talk about politics and politicians and who said what and what's outrageous and who's on what committee, the planet is burning, literally. And we ask as designers, what can we do? What can we do with all this sort of discord, with all this chaos? And so I wanted to sort of think about it for a minute and reflect on a question that was asked to Charles and Ray Eames in the 1950s. They said, what are the limits of design? To which Charles responded, what are the limits of problems? So for Charles and Ray Eames, this idea that design is problem solving in a kind of very expansive way, whether it's sort of supplying wooden splints for the military or comfortable chairs or making movies, you know, they've always been kind of our heroes. And I like their definition of design. About 12 years ago, we published a book in that spirit called Expanded Practice, thinking, you know, where should architects and designers sort of stop? And we sort of embrace the kind of interdisciplinary, we embrace working with technologies and electronics. Our first projects were all kind of interactive light and sound projects. And we argued that media should be a material for architecture. Media should expand the kind of repertoire of what an architect does. 12 years later, we think about media and we sort of wonder what about our lives isn't media, what isn't mediated, what isn't somehow already run through a kind of interface. So whether you're forming geometries on your computer or whether you're surveying a site for a project, whether you're cutting stone with a robot, all these things are mediated always already. And so we started thinking about what is material after media, not just media as a material. And so we've been working on a book. This book is coming out in the fall. It's called Verify and Field, where we've shifted from media as material to sort of material after media. And this also corresponds to a shift in the kinds of projects we're doing, maybe less in the kind of electronic interactive realm, maybe more in the kind of material, hopefully still material innovation realm. So when we ask what matters, the first thing that we think about is, well, matter matters, material matters, and what choices do we make as architects to sort of have a kind of greater impact? And so this first little project I want to share is sited in Spokane, Washington. It's about a kind of instrument for looking at the landscape. The site is quite dramatic. It's the sort of falls, you know, the Spokane River, and the kind of incredible topography of the falls. Our initial concept was to situate two projects on opposite sides of the falls and have them sort of look at each other. And so a kind of place is in a way a kind of instrument. We also looked at the sort of history of the site and said maybe we can use material in an interesting way. So we proposed to use mass timber. It's something that we've been interested in learning about. And this slide I borrowed from Gray Organsky, who very cleverly sort of mapped out in a way the kind of exchanges, material exchanges, you know, if we're using renewable materials versus non-renewable materials of greater and greater kind of energy intensity. And so this diagram, I think, beautifully captures the idea of using something renewable versus using extractive processes to produce different kinds of materials. So we were very interested in saying, could we do something with timber? How do we sort of think about mass timber? How do we use a project to sort of learn about mass timber? It's something that we are not experts on. So we proposed a small pavilion, a kind of two-part amphitheater that faces each other. This is the plan form. two little amphitheaters looking at each other. And we noted that, we used to think um, about wood in terms of the kind of craftsperson, the kind of shop. And now we think about the kind of industrial scale of wood, where wood is harvested, it's used very efficiently, it's composited and engineered. And then how do we use what we've learned from other materials about the kind of working envelope of some of these tools? And so we're looking at mass timber, not in the formats of beams and slabs, but in the formats of kind of sculptural form. And so this project, we call it the timber stepwell. It uses a kind of robotic work envelope to reconceptualize how we think about mass timber, not in terms of parallel planes, sheets, or columns, but rather as a kind of sculptural form where they're non-parallel planes, and we're sort of really exercising the robot in terms of producing sculptural components. So we're working with some collaborators we've worked with very often called Quora Stone. They're based in Wisconsin. We purchased Alaskan yellow cedar. Quora is laminating it into these massive blocks of timber, cutting it out, first with a chainsaw and eventually with the robot. So the kind of rough cuts are done by hand. Eventually, the kind of precise cuts are done with the robot, cataloging the parts and really thinking about mass timber in a different way. Obviously, the benefits of this are arriving on site with very few components and being able to erect a structure quite rapidly. So repeating components and then infill pieces, and arriving at a complete structure very quickly. We think this is kind of interesting to think about this material not as a replacement for steel or concrete, but actually as its own sort of expressive capacities as a volumetric sort of condition. So this is the stepwell after it weathers somewhat. And these are some views of the interior of the stepwell and another view of the interior. So looking for learnings from one project to the next, how do we use what we know about stone to apply it to working with mass timber? These are some of the pieces that are coming off the line. Quite beautiful sculptural volumetric components that will be stacked more in the manner of masonry than timber. The second thing that we want to sort of think about is ecosystems. We know a lot about ecosystems. We don't quite understand how to sort of embed ourselves in them. And so looking at a project in Philadelphia, we know historically Philadelphia is a city sort of between two rivers that sort of historically sort of emerged as a kind of waterfront industry. Here between the Delaware and the Schuylkill is a proposal for the Schuylkill. And what we learn about these rivers is that their tributary area actually takes us all the way into coal country. And what I didn't know about Philadelphia is it's sort of as a kind of epicenter of kind of coal, gas, and extraction. And so what we learned about the Schuylkill River is that it was highly, highly polluted. At some point, it actually caught on fire. And that over time, it's been remediated. And that remediation has actually made the river sort of accessible. Wildlife is returning, and we thought, how do we sort of bring people back to the waterfront to sort of experience that ecosystem in their backyard that they sort of forgot about, that they sort of turned their backs on. And so this little concept model, which I sort of took a picture in our sink, shows the idea of a submersible, something that sort of pushes into the water and sort of reemerges. We had this hunch that this would be an interesting way to sort of reposition a kind of viewer relative to the kind of urban nature in their backyard. So we commissioned a steel fabricator to make a mock-up of a submersible. We launched the submersible in the river and sort of proved that we can actually do a very controlled sort of capsize by filling these ballast chambers with water. We can sink this steel barge basically into the river and produce a kind of new vantage to sort of appreciate the kind of the river almost at eye level. And so this was the sort of mock-up that we deployed in Philadelphia. And having done this, we were able to secure the money, the $2 million, to build the real project, which is this one. And so this is a project we've been working on for about 4 years now to get the permissions and the permits. We have to go through the building department, but also the Parks and Recreation, but also the Army Corps of Engineers, but also plenty of other authorities having jurisdiction. So this is a rendering of the what we call float lab. It's intended to provide these sort of interesting vantages, but it's also scaled to be able to host a number of outdoor sort of workshops and classrooms. This is connected to Bartram's Garden, which is a botanical garden. And the hope is to bring kids to this place, have them do some activities, have them check the water quality, have them sort of peer through microscopes, have them sort of look at the city from a new perspective, and sort of understand in a way the history of this urban ecosystem vis-a-vis the kind of the skyline, but also the kind of extraction industry that's sort of in a way bracketing this urban waterway. Another thing that is very much on our minds is this question of memory, and how do we sort of think about the status of memory in the age of kind of instant updates and notifications. And so as we're sort of distracted by our phones and constant sort of beeping and buzzing, are we still capable of remembering? How do we sort of remember things that are important? So this project was a memorial we did for Sean Collier, who's an MIT police officer who was killed a few years ago during the marathon bombings. And MIT asked Meejan to design a memorial, and they said, we'd love it if it could sort of contain some patriotic symbols like flags and stars and stripes. It'd be nice if it had a kind of boulder, because, you know, Sean loved nature. It'd be good if it had some trees, you know, so a kind of list of sort of requests. At the same time, MIT was sort of embracing this idea of strength, strong, MIT strong, Collier strong. And MIT's motto is mens et manus, hand in mind, to which they added fortis. And so we thought, could strength or structure be part of this memorial? Could we think about the memorial in those terms? At the same time, we wondered if it could be ephemeral, like just a kind of message that sort of passes across our screens. This question of symbols and stars and stripes was hard to sort of think about, but we thought maybe the hand was something that was more accessible, maybe a kind of abstraction of a hand as it intersects with a figure, and the sort of a subtraction of that figure through a Boolean operation could produce a kind of hollowing in the kind of urban landscape of MIT's campus, such that you would sort of feel like there was something missing here, kind of conspicuous absence. So this is the site. It's right between Frank Gehry's Status Center and the Brain and Cognitive Science Center. And this is the Koch Institute of Cancer Research. So this is where Sean was parked when he was killed. We proposed this figure to sort of occupy the site. The idea is that it's a kind of gateway to the campus. The idea is that when you walk through it, you might feel like there was something that was just here and now it's not, something sort of conspicuously absent. And we thought maybe it could be made out of solid blocks of stone. So we sort of were admiring the sort of fit of the Inca sort of masonry and said, maybe it could be solid. And so working with John Oxendorf, a structural engineer at MIT, we sort of said, well, could it be an arch? You know, could we achieve this sort of voided figure as an arch, a kind of five-way arch, an irregular, very shallow, very horizontal arch? So we proposed to MIT that we build this out of solid blocks. And with John's support from a kind of structural engineer, he said it's perfectly achievable. In a way, it might be simpler to make them solid as opposed to trying to clad a kind of a steel or concrete structure. So we did work with John Oxendorf here on the left, and then Hauke Jungehan from Nippers Helbig in the middle, and this is Sam Morelli from Suffolk Construction. And here we're sort of working with physical models to sort of see, you know, how it would be done. The previous video suggested that we work from the outside in and sort of place the keystone last. That's how we understood sort of this traditional kind of construction. It turns out that the kind of fabrication tolerances are so extreme and that we need such a perfect fit that getting 5 faces to align perfectly on the last block seemed too risky. It was a risk to the schedule that it wouldn't fit. So we decided to reverse the order, start with the keystone and work our way out. That way any tolerance would sort of shed towards the perimeter. We did procure the stone in the quarries and sort of found sort of large blocks large enough to sort of meet our needs. And then just working with the engineers, we understood that, it's super deflection sensitive, and the transfer of forces really needed to be absolutely precise. We didn't want any sort of misfitting stones, because misfitting stones could result in concentrated loads, and concentrated loads could result in spontaneous breakage. So we really needed to ensure a kind of near zero tolerance fit. We did work with this Cora Stone again in Wisconsin to sort of figure out a kind of workflow that would take the stones from Virginia to Wisconsin to be carved quite precisely, and then trucked to MIT for installation. And this was our sort of first encounter with digital fabrication at this scale. Cora was fantastic in terms of asking the right questions, working back and forth across digital models. And the part that I wanted to sort of convey is, like, when you sort of send a model and you think, well, surely they can just give me my model fabricated in stone, we sort of neglect to talk about the kind of material resistance that the actual stone will provide. And when we think about precision of digital fabrication, we sort of don't really think about, like, how do we know that it's in fact, how do we verify? So the question of verification that we're sort of asking in the essay in the book is, should we think about techniques of verification at different scales? And so all the trust we have in digital fabrication leads us to believe that we can sort of output a kind of material artifact sort of to the precision standards that we apply to sort of digital processes. When in fact, we were standing in the shop, and the owner of Quora asked me, well, do you know where the interface between the tip of the saw is and the stone? And I said, well, sure we do. The saw is a certain diameter, and the stone has a digital model, so we should know where that interface is. And he said, well, the saw is cutting the stone, but the stone is also cutting the saw. So every time the saw passes, the diameter is diminished ever so slightly. And so how can we be sure? How do we deliver the precision that you've asked for? It turns out that the saw needs to be calibrated after several passes, and adjustments made to the tool pass to sort of account for the kind of diminishing of the saw blade. But in that moment, the idea that the saw is variable and the stone is variable, and that our digital tools actually have to sort of take into account the kind of material reality of the stone and the saw, was something that sort of was really eye-opening. And so working with fabricators like Quora that are thinking through these questions of precision and are kind of intolerance of tolerance, I think was highly sort of eye-opening. We did develop a QA/QC process to verify in a way with some point-to-point dimensions after the fact, so we could verify before they shipped. And once they arrived at site, they were then re-verified in terms of dimensions to make sure that they fit. Here's the first stone, the keystone, labeled K1. And this was constructed over winter to meet a very hard deadline of the anniversary of the killing of Officer Collier. It was built up on scaffolding, as you can see, and the kind of buttresses were sort of added to the vault, which is emerging. All this was built on kind of industrial strength scales. So all the weight of the stone was measured as it was sitting on the scaffolds. Interestingly, you can't see force, but you can measure weight. And so we were measuring weight, and at the moment where the scales, where the scaffold was lowered and the stone went transferred from bearing on the scaffold to bearing on adjacent stones, we were able to sort of watch the kind of transfer process of the loading on the scales from the center to the periphery. So here's a kind of real-time spreadsheet of the load that the scales are seeing. And we were able to sort of verify that, in fact, as the scaffold came down, those forces were sort of transferring to the adjacent stones and ultimately to the buttresses. So after 8 hours removing the scaffolding. John Oxendorf shouted out. We have arching action, which is super exciting after 9 months of sort of watching these stone blocks sort of suspended in midair, waiting for them to engage in arching action. If you come to MIT, you'll see this memorial, and you'll sort of feel the kind of the presence of this sort of hollowing process. It's kind of remarkable. It has its own acoustic sort of qualities in there. And the arch is so shallow that it's sort of unlike something that you've never seen anything like it. Yet it does seem somehow familiar, because this vocabulary of forms are forms that we've become familiar with in our digital spaces. We just haven't seen them materialized in this way in our cities and in our sort of real life. So it has a sort of uncanny sort of presence on campus. Okay, another topic that we've been thinking about is the question of the city and how to build in the city. We've only just started building in the city of Boston, which is a kind of tough city to build in, partly because of so much historic fabric and the kind of processes in place for approvals that require a certain kind of acknowledgement of that historic fabric. And so we're building a building in Bay Village, which is it's a landmark district in the city of Boston. So there's a very rigorous process for getting approved in this neighborhood. And we spent about 4 years on the approvals. So it's been quite a struggle. As the project went forward, we sort of sketched out some ideas of what we thought it might be. It's a 20-story multifamily residential building in a neighborhood which is surrounded primarily between 2- and 3-story brick sort of brownstone sort of buildings. But it's also along what Kevin Lynch would call the high spine. So there's a number of tall buildings that connect the Prudential to the downtown. And we are along that sort of corridor. So we're right between two neighborhoods, thinking maybe it could be tall, maybe it has to sort of defer somewhat to this historic neighborhood adjacent to it. So a lot of our studies had to do with scaling effects. How do we sort of break down the scale? How do we acknowledge the units? How do we provide outdoor spaces? And one of the things that we learned is that the kind of perception of a building's scale is really a function of how we sort of articulate its sort of mass. So we could articulate it as a kind of monolith, or what we've sort of come to call a coursed block, almost like a series of masonry courses. So this was a proposal to sort of course the floors into packages of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 that attenuates as it rises. In terms of the plan making, it's pretty much this whole site area. And so we've sort of maxed out the site and strategically positioned the core and stairs to absorb the kind of depth that we don't need. And then the expression is really a kind of question of how do we provide a kind of thick, kind of sculptural skin that would be appropriate in this sort of historic neighborhood. So we propose a series of concave piers that are made of repetitive sort of molds, and then we tried to optimize for a lot of variation with as few molds as possible. We very quickly sort of translated these into plaster and eventually stone to sort of engage with the client and the community in terms of what would be appropriate in this neighborhood. And here's the proposal maybe in its context, where we see some of the context. But from the neighborhood, these 2- and 3-story brick buildings, this building will be a kind of bookend to the neighborhood. The fluting of the piers, I think, is a gesture to the kind of textures of the historic context. And one of the arguments is that it's not sort of stylistically related to anything in the neighborhood, but it does have a sense of quality. And what everyone's afraid of is a building that is thin and unarticulated, that has no qualities. And so we've proposed a building that's thick and heavy, sort of massive, as opposed to light. Another lesson we learned is like neighbors who are predisposed to object to a new construction in their neighborhood respond better when you say, oh, you're not going to be looking at our loading dock, you're going to be looking at new neighbors in these townhomes. So we have 2 townhomes facing across the street from these other townhomes. And so the loading docks on Stewart Street and Shamet Street has more residential character. And so the detailing as this building meets the ground sort of has a play on the kind of decorative ironwork and the stoops and the planter boxes that the neighbors have. But it's how we sort of manage to negotiate a kind of tall building sort of meeting the ground as it sort of plugs into this residential neighborhood in Boston. This is a rendered view of the tower seen from the park across the way. We always mock things up in by any material we have. This is EPS foam, just looking at the curvature and the kind of ability to sort of cast shadows. And the shadows of this are actually what makes it really special. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. So here are the molds. Some of these are 3 stories tall, these sort of concave profiles. The kind of critical dimension is a kind of 6-inch minimum, to sort of cover the rebar. So we go from about 14 inches to about 6 inches from the edge to the valley. And these are some of the mold pieces sort of coming off the molds. We're sort of admiring their geometries, and when they sort of catch the light, they really sort of come to life. We did a lot of studies of optimization for molds, and we learned that the best optimization is actually for picks, how many times the crane has to pick them. So we can buy more molds, but buying crane time is actually the thing to optimize for. So it's not material, it turns out it's labor. And building in the city, Boston, where union labor is a premium, how do we minimize the amount of labor time? Well, these 2-story, 3-story piers have been erected very quickly. I took this photo a few weeks ago, and then I took this photo yesterday. And the panels are just sort of shooting up, and you can really see the kind of elongation of these courses as they sort of climb up the building. And this one was from a few days ago, where they're placing this 3-story panel at the very top of the building. So I think we did develop a system which sort of accelerated construction and minimized labor. It did introduce other problems like differential deflection and live loading on alternating floor slabs. But our hunch about sort of saving time through labor was a kind of interesting sort of learning. And this is the backside. This is the side that faces the neighborhood. And we see the sort of the kind of shearing of the courses at the different floor packages, and the kind of the way the sun hits it to sort of really amplify the kind of depth of this facade, which I think is unlike anything else that we're seeing being built in Boston today. Okay, switching gears a little bit to another topic that's very much on our minds. What matters? What's happening? What's going on? Sort of globalization is going on. This is an old cover of PA magazine from 1995. The year I graduated from college, this was on the cover of PA, and I thought, oh, that's exciting. I'd like to go work in Asia and build these sort of futures. So at the same time, we've got globalization, we've got sort of intense localization. And one of the things I say sometimes is that all construction, like politics, all construction is local. You can't actually sort of impose a kind of universal sort of construction in a place that you're not familiar. The client for this project insisted that we build a traditional Chinese courtyard house. And because this was an opportunity for us, we said, of course, we can design a courtyard house in the Chinese tradition of Chinese courtyard houses. So this is the project we built. This is now maybe almost 10 years old in Chengdu. It's supposed to fit into this sort of odd-shaped sort of puzzle piece master plan. We were asked to look at traditional Chinese architecture where the buildings form the frame and the figure. And so you have a building that is seen in the round, and you have buildings that are really part of a kind of field condition. And then you have a kind of wall that sort of bounds the garden. And we didn't really quite understand what was being asked of us when we had to look at this typology. But the client insisted that we build something that had Chinese feeling. And that had a hard time translating, despite the fact that I'm half Chinese. And I asked my mom, like, what are they talking about? Is there something that we can point to and say, what is Chinese feeling? So this was our scheme in the upper right-hand corner. These are some of our colleagues who are also struggling with the same question. How do you sort of build a contemporary sort of Chinese courtyard house? The client sent us to look at these courtyards and gardens, and we tried to experience, Chinese feeling in this moment here. My Chinese colleague said that sort of foggy, sort of opaqueness, that's Chinese feeling. So we went back and revised our schemes. We sort of came up with a set of drawings. We submitted the drawings, and then we didn't hear from them for 9 months. When we did hear from them, they said, your building's under construction, actually, and can you help us with the material choices? And so we quickly sort of developed a palette of sort of these gray bricks and Corten steel window surrounds. The thing about this building is that it seems much taller than it is. It's a 2-story building, and the amount of opaque surfaces was quite significant. So amplifying the windows with these Corten surrounds, I think, helped sort of give the fenestration a larger sort of presence. And the part that I think was really successful was where we sort of looked at the sort of most pervasive sort of material available in the region was this sort of gray brick. And we said, well, maybe if each brick had a kind of internal compass to it, maybe each brick sort of oriented itself on the cardinal directions, maybe that would sort of give this building some rigor. And so we did 2 sheets of drawings where all the east-west bricks are aligned, and as they start to transition to these oblique surfaces, they start to stagger. And so at every corner, whether it's sort of cardinal or oblique, the brick would sort of signal a kind of true north. And so when you walk around the building, you see transitions from true east-west to oblique surfaces. A kind of east-west wall meets a diagonal wall, and 2 oblique walls sort of coming together. And this very simple idea of giving each brick a kind of rule was something that translated very easily, not just to the client, but also to the stonemasons. And the fact that they were able to sort of execute this without elaborate drawings, without a lot of templates and sort of unique conditions. This sort of very basic logic actually sort of gives the building a kind of signature texture. It sort of, I think it sort of embeds in a way, or it encodes the kind of construction logic and the kind of the labor into it. And the client said, oh, this also gives me a kind of Chinese feeling. So we were able to succeed in sort of making a connection, both aesthetically, culturally, but also sort of tectonically, to a client who was really insisting on something having a kind of strong connection to place. We're currently still working in China. We're doing a lot of projects in China. One of them is in Shanghai, on the site of the former Expo, the 2010 Expo site. This is Heatherwick's sort of hedgehog pavilion. This was, I think, one of the Chinese pavilions. And so the same year, 2010, where Heatherwick was building a kind of building that had no sort of easily understood edge. I think looking into the future, the Chinese pavilion was still sort of recalling a kind of traditional sort of dogong, sort of stacked lumber kind of form. So our proposal, this is the Expo site, is for 2 bridges on this artificial lake. We had spent enough time in China to sort of understand that, the Chinese landscape is not about a series of objects sort of standing in the landscape. It's really a set of relationships between these objects. And so when we presented, we said, we're not building 2 bridges, we're actually building 1 bridge that frames the water. And so this sort of concept of a kind of way to bracket the water and create, in a way, a kind of set of apertures that were about framing the water and framing the sky was what we presented. The idea that the bridge is not so much a way to get from A to B, but actually a place to be on itself, that there are destinations sort of on the bridge, and that there's moments on this bridge that look across at other moments on the bridge. And so I think we're able to sort of articulate how this might sort of tie into a kind of larger tradition of Chinese sort of garden structures. Was, I think, one of the reasons why we were successful in this competition. So we call it the Moon Gate Bridge. The Moon Gate is one of the most iconic of Chinese architectural devices. But rather than framing views or portals, we're actually sort of framing the kind of reflections in the water and in the sky. So that was one of the slides we showed. This project was awarded actually through that competition, and again, there was a period of time where we weren't sure what was happening, and then last minute they said, it's under construction, so we need your help. We always sort of mock things up. There's a kind of site cast concrete shape with a sort of textured brick inner liner, as shown here, outside smooth concrete, inside sort of textured brick. It was always exciting to see working drawings. In a way, it sort of verifies that this is actually happening. But also getting construction photos is always kind of exciting to see that they are in fact sort of moving forward with this construction. So this has been under construction almost entirely during the last year during COVID. So no one's been able to travel there, but we do, in a way, have lots of communications with the client and the LDI, the local design institute, on everything from formwork to concrete mix to stone selection and everything. So this formwork is quite impressive. It's a compound curvature that forms that concrete liner, which is then faced with the sort of granite blocks on the inside. So this is exciting to see this sort of coming together. The last project I want to show, and then I'd love to open it up for some questions, is the question of institutions. I think as architects, we're sort of subject to all kinds of forces, external forces. We're not sure where we have agency. And institutions seem to be one of the sites of power or opportunity, capacity. A few years ago, we submitted qualifications to the University of Virginia to help them think through this question of telling the story of UVA's relationship to enslavement. And we know Jefferson as a kind of heroic figure, architect, diplomat, author of the Declaration of Independence, surveyor. The official narratives that are sort of, engraved in these UNESCO World Heritage markers talk about his ideas of a kind of utopian academical village, but it makes no mention of the history of slavery, which we now know. This sort of early etching of Jefferson's sort of utopian setting, in a way, in the bottom left-hand corner, contains an image that sort of reveals the kind of ugly history of UVA kind of hiding in plain sight. And so, whereas Jefferson sort of imagined this as a kind of ideal society, he also understood that for this ideal society to function, it needed to sort of run on the forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. And so one of the things we learn is that from the lawn side, we get this sort of pristine sort of enfilade, this sort of colonnade, sort of culminating in the rotunda. We see these two-story pavilions sort of contrasting with the one-story colonnades that house, I think, 179 students on the lawn. We don't really think about the basement, the walkout basement, and who lived in there. And so some of the architectural historians at UVA sort of alerted us to the fact that Jefferson, as an architect, was using the section to conceal a practice that he understood to be kind of abhorrent, the enslavement of people against their will to provide labor to allow this ideal society to function. And so that cross-section, that sort of topographical condition which Jefferson exploited, is what allowed him to sort of stage, in a way, this ideal society and conceal the parts that in certain historians' readings, they're arguing that Jefferson understood what he was doing. He understood that he was, participating in a system that he felt powerless to actually change. And so these sort of gardens that are sort of surrounded by the serpentine walls that we sort of know from architectural history are not so much about sort of pleasure gardens and any sort of tradition of garden making, but they're actually sort of concealing the kind of the day-to-day sort of life of forced labor. And so when you think about that, and you think about Jefferson as an architect, it completely sort of changes the way we sort of think about the ideals upon which um, the campus was constructed. And so I believe it was 2008, the leadership of the University of Virginia laid this stone at the bottom of the rotunda to honor the several hundred men, women and men, both free and enslaved, whose labor between 1817 and 1826 helped to realize Thomas Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia. So this stone plaque was incorrect. It was too small. It was poorly sited. The insufficiency of this plaque, I think, is what catalyzed a group of students to form what they called the MEL, the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers group. And they created pressure and visibility to this cause to force the university to acknowledge its history in a significant way. And so from pressure from the student group, the university took a number of actions, including forming the President's Commission on Slavery on the university. They did scholarship, they looked through documents, they assembled names, and the last thing they did is they hired an architectural team to develop a concept for the memorial. And so this process was ongoing for, I believe it was 6 years before they brought a team in started to work on this. We put together a team, Megan and myself, with Frank Dukes, who's a UVA professor, a kind of community engagement specialist, Mabel Wilson, who's a historian and an architect. She teaches at Columbia. Greg Bleem is a landscape architect, local to Charlottesville, and Eto Otitigbe is a Brooklyn-based artist. So we put together this team, and before we started designing anything, we sort of designed a process. And so we sort of met with communities, met with faculty and students, met with people in the neighborhoods, people that were descendants of the enslaved, and we listened and we heard. And for 6 months, we tried to figure out what it was that they were interested in, what a memorial could be. There was no site, there was no budget, there was no program. And here's Mabel and Frank sort of in one of our charrettes. We did a lot of meetings with students, a lot of meetings with neighbors, with people in the community, understanding the history of enslavement at UVA and building on the fantastic work that the President's Commission on Slavery in the University had done. There's a lot of outreach, and at the end of the day, we made a few proposals, for where it could be. We were struck by this term, "Let Freedom Ring," and this, what we learned about this sort of African dance called the ring shout, and we thought maybe it could be as simple as a ring, just a kind of empty hollow, a kind of clearing where people could sort of define a kind of void, so similar to the MIT memorial, where the sort of the main effect is a kind of emptiness. Here it's much larger. It's a kind of 80-foot diameter sort of patch of grass that's sort of encircled by what we call a kind of rising ridge or horizon line. So this represents a kind of, two cones intersecting, one with a kind of rotated axis, but it produces a kind of interior surface and exterior surface. And it sort of masks, in a way, the context. So this was one of the representations where we can create a kind of a clearing for people to gather, a place to gather for them to recognize themselves as a community, but also to reflect on what the history of this place has been. It turns out it's almost exactly the same diameter as Jefferson's Rotunda, which was actually a surprise to me. It's about 80 foot, kind of half a sphere, kind of dome, and a kind of bowl-like shape. So they seem to be kind of in dialogue. Some of the geometry, some of the kind of construction documents, and then mocking things up. I mean, we sort of, set this angle of this cone by the kind of the tip of your toe to your outstretched arm, and then how does that sort of rise over your head so that you're not looking out, but you're sort of looking in. And then from the outside, how do we create a surface that creates a kind of explicit sense of enclosure, and invite you to sort of come around and enter it. So again, we worked with Quarry Stone in Wisconsin to sort of carve and mill these components to form this cross section. Working with Eto, he was sort of inspired by the kind of crude sort of stonework in some of the gravestones from that period. We were all kind of impressed by the kind of imagery of the kind of scars and wounds from this historic photograph. And we learned about Isabella Gibbons, who was an enslaved woman who was owned by William Barton Rogers. And if that name is familiar, he's the founder of MIT. You know, before founding MIT, he was a professor at UVA, and he had slaves. And so Isabella Gibbons was enslaved by him and worked for him. She had been actually taught to read and write. And after the Civil War, she stayed in Charlottesville and taught at the Thomas Jefferson School, and wrote about her experiences. And so she's one of the few of the enslaved for whom we have a kind of photographic record and for whom we have actually writings sort of describing her experience. Eto, his previous work had looked at, you know, self-portraits and translating images from a kind of raster to vector files. He had carved his own portraits using basically scripting CNC tools to alter the kind of depth of a kind of groove. He took Isabella's portrait and her eyes and etched it into the stone to sort of create a series of grooves that would sort of contain in their variable depths a kind of abstraction of an image. So we applied this technique at a larger scale, sort of overlaid it within a field of converging lines that sort of both evoke the kind of rough textures of the kind of carved stone, but also the kind of quarry marks that we see in quarried stone. And embedded in that pattern is the eye from Isabella Gibbons. So this is talking about the raster to vector. And if you go to Charlottesville, I encourage you to sort of walk around it because it's something that you don't perceive right away. These sort of grooves don't have any images, but at a certain moment, in a certain light, Isabella's eyes sort of come out. And some of the descendants have said, well, this is amazing. She's kind of a witness and a watcher. She's sort of, as their ancestors, she's somehow watching over them. And so the descendants have really sort of taken this memorial as a kind of gesture at the beginning of the discussion about repair in a kind of, you know, very sort of fractured sort of relationship between the university and the descendant community. For us, participating in this process was a learning experience, both in terms of history and sort of learning and engaging with different groups, advocacy and negotiation, but also technical learning. The crew that fabricated actually erected, and the kind of tolerances for this for these alignments were so precise to get these sort of stones to sort of coalesce into a single line. And the more we work with material, the more we realize that in a way for these kind of sculptural effects, the kind of translation from a kind of computer model to sort of material in the world takes on more and more importance. You know, for this to feel like a single horizon line, each of these individual pieces of stone needs to be precisely set. And so we note that when we sort of see these projects, there's a kind of flickering between a kind of physical material and a kind of pre-vision of the project in our digital tools. We note how these things come together really depends on an incredible amount of precision in its setting, not just in its fabrication, and how materials are detailed to come together in certain ways, I think takes on sort of a lot of significance. And so when we're in the field and we see this sort of ridge line where we have two pieces of stone meeting at a quirk miter, we also sort of see the kind of preview of that image in our computers, almost as if it sort of leapt out of our computers into the world. Obviously, it's not that simple. A couple of details. One of the programs was to sort of name all the names that were known. And in many cases, many of the enslaved weren't named. They were just called extra hands, or Mason, or family of three. And so working with the scholars to sort of acknowledge the estimated 4,000 men, women, and children that were enslaved at the university. Sorry, there's a lot of sirens going on. We worked with very fragmented information, very few actual names. And so when we engraved the stone, we had 4,000 marks, which we called memory marks or gashes. They're kind of underscores, they're placeholders for future names. When we knew the names, like Isaiah, we carved in Isaiah. When it was Isabella Gibbons, we carved in both names. When they were referred to by craft or trade or kinship, like farmer or mother, we carved those into the stone as well. And so if you go, you'll experience this kind of horizon line, which sort of quickly sort of masks out the world around you. And when I was there was a afternoon thunderstorm, and I saw the memorial sort of wet and then very quickly drying, and the water had gathered in these cuts and was sort of almost as if it was tearing up or bleeding. So a kind of surprise effect. So just to wrap up, we weren't able to dedicate the memorial because of COVID. And as COVID hit and the construction site shut down, we also experienced the multiple traumas of the sort of deaths of George Floyd and many others. In some cases, people came to the memorial to reflect on the history, but also the present. They came individually or in groups. And shortly after it opened, it became a kind of site where people would come and say, we need to sort of reaffirm our values. And so here people are taking a knee and reaffirming their values. And almost spontaneously, the project became a site for this kind of collective assertion of values, both remembrance of a kind of history, but also a kind of commitment to making change in the present. And so maybe the last theme that I wanted to end with in terms of what matters, change matters, positive change that affects people's lives, and that we all sort of engage in as designers as we kind of shape the kind of built environment, the landscape, through the materials that we specify, through the forms that we use, through the stories we tell, and how our architecture actually shapes those lives and encourages these kind of platforms for this productive change. Maybe as a coda to this, and then I'll turn it over to questions. We started with 4,000 marks, but we didn't know many of the names. And we said maybe as names are discovered in the archives, we can add those names. And then a few weeks ago, UVA added 5 names to the memorial, and they were sort of etched into the stone. And in a way, the idea that the memorial is open-ended is nice, because it sort of takes something that was kind of brutally obscured and omitted into something that is open and anticipatory. It anticipates more information. And so maybe I'll leave with one last quote. This is from Herbert Simon that says, if science is the study of the world as it is, design is the study of the world as it ought to be. And that ought to be-ness, I think, is what sort of excites us about how we want to think about design and sort of transforming the world into what we think it ought to be like. Okay, so maybe with that, I will stop and have a drink.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Eric, thank you so much for this lecture. I am sort of incredibly moved by the work and by how you presented it. Even knowing your projects for so long, hearing you present them and organize them, it adds somehow a new dimension of depth and importance relative to, I think, the critical issues of our time. So thank you. Maybe just in this seat, I get to kick off the Q&A. I get to ask the first question. And I have many, but obviously we want to also answer as they come in the chat. But um, one of the things that I thought it was incredibly striking was the seamless way in which you discuss incredibly technical aspects of the work relative to the conceptual basis and the aspirations of the projects. So maybe I wanted to ask something around problem solving, or Höweler Yoon's version of problem solving. So I love that throughout the lecture you showed working documents, drawings that could be from, or probably are from, a CD or a DD set, some type of interface with engineers and constructors and so on and so forth. And specifically your relationship to details. And it seems to me that in your case, details are not really a problem solving. You know how many architects, and specifically perhaps also in the context of school, many processes start with massing, kind of a big view, and then you progressively zoom in until you get to that detail. And after hearing you present, it seems to me that the way you think about material culture and assembly and processes are actually not just the problem solving, but perhaps more analogous to the INS definition that you started with. And it's about a new sort of culture around materials, a new culture around craft, assembly methods, used as the conceptual basis for the projects. It made me think, I don't know, from the Chengdu project to the bridge in China, that you're developing new languages for iconography through material and tectonic ideas. So I guess in a sense it's details, but I'm asking about design process, an alternative to what I just described. So the question was like, what comes first, the building or the egg?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, it's nice to start to see patterns in your own work. I mean, we just worked on a book, and so we've been looking backwards at a body of work and trying to make connections and see what's shared and what's different. I think that's a great way to sort of reflect on your own work, is to sort of look back and try to write about it. It's also nice when you find that you're not doing things for the first time. You're like, oh, I'm sort of articulating these parts in a way that's recalling this other project, and what is that? What is it that we're doing? Is that a I don't know, is it chance? Is it a set of concerns? We don't think of ourselves as having a kind of signature, we're not really interested in a kind of image, but we have a set of concerns that repeat, and so the kind of legibility of the components as they assemble into a kind of singular thing, kind of part to whole. I think that's what we see in Chengdu and in Shanghai on that bridge. On the other hand, UVA is made of parts, but it sort of obscures those parts into a single line, and the kind of singularity of that line is so important. So I think, whether we're trying to achieve a kind of seamlessness or we're trying to achieve a kind of seamfulness is dependent on the project. But I think this idea of translating a kind of intent into material, into the world, I think is something that we maybe spans all the projects. To the question of detail, we've been thinking a lot about, like, detailing doesn't have an after design. I say that detailing is the kind of inertia of an idea as it sort of moves from sort of concept into construction. And I like that there's no separation between, like, conceptual drawing and technical drawing and ultimately sort of construction drawing. That should be the same line, the same inertia. And when I teach at the GSD, I tell my students, like, technical courses are not, another world. They're not separate from design. I call them all design courses. You take a class with me on construction, we're talking about design. We're not talking about, technical this or that. It's just more in depth and, more considered. We've had more time to think about it. So I've been trying to blur that line between technical courses and design courses, pedagogically. But also in our work, we want to sort of put our money where our mouth is. If we're talking about, celebrating labor, acknowledging what skill is available, what the constraints are, whether it's crane picks or hand handset bricks. I mean, it's good to know those things and incorporate them into design so that the designs start to sort of manifest those constraints.
It's really great to hear that also as it enters the world of education and produces a frame to, I guess, make connections, which sometimes sort of that reflection period happens after with distance, as you said, and as work begins to accumulate, but it can also be sort of a learned process, right? I have a couple more questions, and I don't know if Tess has gotten direct questions, but first I'll share something that came up in the Q&A chat, something I think almost very technical, and then we can again move back and forth. This is a question that says, what programs were used in the memorial modeling? Was it one model collaborated on across the engineer and fabricator?
Yeah, I like nerding out on technical questions like that. I mean, I think, you know, just the dumb question is like, what do we use to model? I think, or how do you begin a design process, right? And so, you know, does it begin with a freehand sketch? Does it begin with a kind of idea? Does it begin Rhino? And I think it's in all those things. You know, we talk about it, we draw it, you know, quickly by hand, and then someone sketches it in Rhino. So it started in Rhino, and obviously it goes quickly to other programs like structural engineering programs that are doing structural analysis. And so what we learn is that most structural engineering softwares are designed for tension and compression. And when we gave them a model that had only compression, the structural model had trouble with a scheme that has no tension, right? Because there's zero tension in all compression structure. That was kind of interesting. They modeled it in many different structural softwares, and we had 4 different structural engineers, and they argued about it for about 6 months, which was eye-opening because I was like, surely there's one right answer, right? And it's not true. There's so many ways to interpret things, even in terms of structural, you know, engineering, calculating, and so on. So that was also interesting. And ultimately, the same geometry goes to the fabricator to set up their tool paths to carve the stone. And so you know, even though we talk about a kind of separation of representation and construction, you know, to go back to sort of Robin Evans' sort of translations from, you know, drawing a building, the same software is being, you know, passed around, which has huge sort of impacts in terms of liability and risk. But I think, you know, more polemically, I think it sort of points to a kind of tension where there's a kind of desire to streamline and use technology for its capacity across different platforms, while culture and society and the kind of legal dimensions of practice are sort of trying to keep us sort of neatly apart. And we note this sort of means and methods question in our book, where we talk about the kind of the tensions between workflows that are sort of pushing towards seamlessness versus sort of cultural and professional structures and legal structures like contracts that are sort of keeping us apart. And how do we sort of think more intelligently about those constraints and try to realize things sort of within those constraints, or how do we sort of work around some of those constraints?
Sorry, you just saw me type. I want to make sure that I don't miss questions. And I am very conscious of time. So I'm just going to ask one more thing that I think encapsulates some sort of general, the gist of some other general comments. By the way, I forgot to say that I thought that any lecture that had the phrase arching action in it was quite interesting. But all jokes aside, based on what you just said, it made me think of another time I saw your lecture that I thought it was very interesting. The main lens, deceivingly, was budget. You talked about 2 projects that had cost exactly the same thing, but were completely different in scope. And I think immediately was understood that the real message of the lecture was that in the end, it's always a cultural and a social project, and that all of these conversations around techniques and technology and stakeholders and money and all of that really are an integral part of the complex processes that architecture has to go through. And I think you're You mastered that so beautifully. Um, I was thinking that architecture for a long time has been focused on issues around performance and things that are very quantitative. And today you offer memory as one of those perhaps non-quantitative issues, even with the diagrams that you showed for the UVA memorial. There are qualities that certainly are not quantitative. So I was thinking, coming out on the other side of this by now 20, 25-year-old digital turn, how can we revise ideas related to non-quantitative issues that for a long time were outside of discourse? And again, you offered memory today. Can you think of others? Are we ready again to talk about perhaps things like beauty or style, or I know now things like atmosphere, or how do we start that conversation without making it the old conversation, but again, addressing the issues of our time?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. I think every generation tries to distance itself from the previous one, initially rejecting their terms like, phenomena, like a kind of sentimental, sort of essential quality about materials. Um, we always want to sort of find new expressions for materials and not sort of fall into sort of traps of like, this really wants to be this or this wants to be that. And so, um, at the same time, we're using very precise tools and recognizing the limits of precision. I think that's an important sort of message. We nerd out on techniques, but ultimately you have to allow for room for surprise and discovery. When I saw the kind of the tearing up of the memorial, I was blown away, and I was like, oh my God, look at this. And I showed it to Mijin and she's like, oh yeah, I knew that would happen. Uh, so, I think you want to be able to be surprised by your own work too. Even if you're being very precise, there's got to be a way. And one thing I say is like, we're always learning how we design, we haven't figured it out completely. And so I think for students as well, it's important to sort of develop a way that you can learn how you design, and find your way to design what works for you. Is it like lots of physical models? Is it like a full scale prototype? Is it, super photorealistic renderings or other means? But we're still enjoying learning about our own design process and finding these surprising moments that are, I think, hard to quantify, but really introduce qualities that were unexpected and surprising.
Where surprise and discovery sound really hopeful to me, and something that I think we can all use for at the sort of other edge of these challenging times. So, Eric, thank you so much. Seriously, what a wonderful lecture for us to sort of end the academic year with. I hope we can do this in person in LA with the qualities of, a conversation that are different. So looking forward to the next one.
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.